Welcome back to the Story Vault. Today we bring you another gripping Agatha Christie mystery, The Death of Inspector Slack. A Miss Marple Mystery. This story is filled with secrets, deception, and a chilling murder that only Miss Marple's sharp intuition can unravel. So, without any delay, let's begin. Let's start with Chapter 1. A farewell roast beef and an unopened envelope. The October evening had settled over St. Mary-Me like a comfortable blanket, bringing with it that particular melancholy that accompanies the end of things. In the church hall, where so many village gatherings had taken place over the years, the overhead lights cast a warm glow over the assembled company. The scent of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding filled the air, mingling with the autumn dampness that seemed to seep through even the stoutest walls. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner chair, her knitting needles clicking in a gentle rhythm that had become as familiar to the villagers as the church bells. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild behind wire-rimmed spectacles, observed the proceedings with that particular attention she reserved for human nature in all its fascinating complexity. Tonight was special, though she doubted many of the guests truly understood just how special it would prove to be. Lady Bantry, resplendent in her best burgundy velvet, was holding court near the serving table with all the grace of a born hostess. She had thrown herself into the organization of this farewell dinner with characteristic enthusiasm, determined that Inspector Dermot Slack should receive a proper send-off after 32 years of service to the Downshire Constabulary. 32 years, Lady Bantry was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the hall. Think of all the cases, all the criminals brought to justice. We shall quite miss having our very own Inspector Slack keeping the peace in St. Mary-Me. Inspector Slack himself stood near the head table, his weathered face bearing that expression of gruff embarrassment that overtook him whenever he was the center of attention. He was not a man given to sentiment, but even he seemed touched by the effort that had gone into this evening. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his medals gleaming, and his usually stern demeanor had softened somewhat in the warmth of the gathering. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily as she studied the inspector's face. There was something there, a tension beneath the surface that spoke of more than mere retirement nerves. She had known Dermot Slack for many years, had watched him work through some of the most puzzling cases that had ever disturbed the peace of their quiet village, and she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when something was troubling him. Sergeant Harold Lake stood at Slack's right hand, his promotion to inspector all but assured once Slack's retirement became official. Lake was a solid man, reliable and methodical, though perhaps lacking some of the intuitive spark that had made Slack such an effective investigator. Still, he had served faithfully, and Miss Marple had no doubt he would do his best to fill his superior's shoes. "Speech! Speech!" called Major Archie Finn from across the room. Raising his glass of cherry with theatrical enthusiasm, the Major was visiting from the Home Office, ostensibly to assess the local training facilities, though Miss Marple suspected there might be more to his presence than met the eye. She had noticed how his genial manner seemed to slip occasionally, revealing something sharper beneath. Constable Fred Lockhack, earnest and eager as a young spaniel, hurried forward with a chair for the inspector. Locke had been Slack's protégé for the past 3 years, and his devotion to his superior was touching to observe. He hung on Slack's every word, notebook always at the ready, determined to learn everything he could from the experienced officer. Near the serving hatch, Agnes Cutter was arranging the dessert plates with her usual efficiency. The civilian clerk had typed countless reports and station diaries over the years, her fingers as familiar with the keys of her typewriter as Miss Marple's were with her knitting needles. She was a quiet woman, unremarkable in appearance, But Miss Marple had always found that the quiet ones often knew more than they let on. Edith Slack, the inspector's sister, sat ramrod straight at the head table, her no-nonsense demeanor a perfect complement to her brother's gruff exterior. She'd kept house for Dermat since their mother's death 20 years ago, and Miss Marple suspected that Edith was looking forward to having her brother home more often, though she would never admit to such sentiment. It was at that moment, as Inspector Slack was clearing his throat to respond to the calls for a speech, that a small commotion occurred near the door. A young boy, perhaps 12 or 13, had slipped into the hall carrying a buff-cold envelope. He looked around uncertainly for a moment before approaching the inspector. "Begging your pardon, sir," the boy said, holding out the envelope. "I was told to give this to Inspector Slack special-like." Slack took the envelope with a frown, turning it over in his hands. There was no return address, no indication of who might have sent it. The boy had already vanished back into the October evening before anyone thought to question him further. Miss Marple watched with growing interest as the inspector's face changed upon seeing the envelope. The color seemed to drain from his weathered cheeks, and his hand trembled slightly as he slipped the unopened envelope into his uniform pocket. Whatever that letter contained, it had shaken him considerably. "Well, then," Slack said, his voice slightly hoarser than usual, "I suppose I should say a few words." He raised his glass, and the assembled company fell silent. Miss Marple noticed that his hand was quite steady now, though she could see the outline of the envelope creating a slight bulge in his breast pocket. 32 years, Slack began, echoing Lady Bantry's earlier words. 32 years of serving this community, of trying to keep the peace and see that justice is done. I've worked with good men and women, solved cases that seemed impossible, and learned that truth has a way of coming to light no matter how deeply it's buried. Major Finn raised his glass higher. To Inspector Slack, he called out, "A man who has always kept clean books and a clear conscience. The Home Office could use more officers of his caliber." It was then that Miss Marple observed something curious. At the Major's words about clean books, Inspector Slack's hand gave another almost imperceptible tremor. It was the slightest of movements, barely noticeable unless one was watching for such things, but Miss Marple's keen eyes missed very little. The toast was drunk with appropriate ceremony, and the evening continued with the easy flow of village social gatherings. There were stories told and memories shared, laughter and gentle teasing, all the comfortable rituals that marked such occasions, but Miss Marple found her attention returning again and again to that unopened envelope and the way it had affected the usually unflappable inspector. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to make their farewells, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to walk home through the quiet streets of St. Mary Me. The October air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of woods smoke and fallen leaves. She paused at the church hall door to look back at Inspector Slack, who was shaking hands with the last of the well-wishers. Whatever that envelope contained, she had the distinct feeling that this farewell dinner marked more than simply the end of a career. In her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that secrets like chickens had a way of coming home to roost, and something told her that morning would bring revelations that none of them were prepared for. Chapter 2. Shots on the Disused Firing Range. Dawn came to St. Mary Me with that particular clarity that October mornings possess, when the air is sharp and clean, and every blade of grass seems etched against the pale sky. Miss Marple, an early riser by habit and inclination, was tending to her garden when she heard the distant sound that would forever change the quiet rhythm of village life. 2 sharp cracks echoed across the countryside, unmistakably the sound of gunfire. They came from the direction of the old constabulary training range, a facility that had been largely abandoned for the past 5 years since the new shooting grounds had been established closer to the county headquarters. Miss Marple straightened from her rose bushes, her experienced ear distinguishing between the sounds. The first shot had been followed almost immediately by a second, but there had been something different about them, a quality she could not quite define. Living in a village where the local farmers occasionally dealt with vermin, she was accustomed to the sound of firearms. But these shots had carried a different resonance entirely. It was not yet 7 o'clock when Major Archie Finn's motor car pulled up outside Sergeant Lakes's cottage. With an urgent grinding of gears, the Major, despite his genial appearance at the previous evening's dinner, was clearly a man of action when circumstances demanded it. "Like," Finn called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, "we need to get to the old range immediately. I want to conduct some ballistic tests before I file my report with the Home Office." Sergeant Lake emerged from his cottage, hastily buttoning his uniform tunic and looking somewhat bewildered by this early morning summons. He was a methodical man who preferred to begin his days in an orderly fashion, and Major Finn's sudden urgency clearly unsettled him. "The old range, sir?" Lake questioned, settling himself into the passenger seat of Finn's vehicle. "But we haven't used those facilities for years. The equipment is all but abandoned." "Precisely why I need to see it," Finn replied tersely, engaging the clutch with more force than necessary. "The Home Office requires a complete assessment of all training facilities, operational or otherwise. Besides, the acoustics are better there for testing sound patterns." As they drove through the village, Miss Marple observed their passage from her garden gate. There was something about Major Finn's manner that suggested this impromptu expedition was about more than routine bureaucratic requirements. The urgency in his voice, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, all spoke of a man operating under considerable pressure. The old firing range lay approximately 2 miles from the village center, nestled in a natural depression between 2 hills that had made it ideal for containing the sound of gunfire during training exercises. The facility consisted of a concrete firing platform, a series of earthwork butts, and the mechanical target trolley system that had once been the pride of the local constabulary. When Major Finn and Sergeant Lake arrived at the range, they found the gate chain unlocked, hanging loose in a way that immediately caught Lake's attention. He distinctly remembered securing the facility after his last inspection 6 months ago, and the sight of the open gate sent a chill of apprehension through him. "That's odd," Lake muttered, examining the chain. "This should be locked. I have the only spare key apart from Inspector Slack." "Perhaps Slack came out here early," Finn suggested, though his tone suggested he found this explanation less than satisfactory. "Wanted to have a final look at the old place before his retirement becomes official." They walked down the worn path toward the firing positions, their footsteps echoing strangely in the morning stillness. The range had an abandoned quality that spoke of years of neglect, with weeds growing up through cracks in the concrete, and rust staining the metal fittings of the target system. It was Sergeant Lake who saw him first. Inspector Dermot's Slack lay sprawled beside the target trolley mechanism, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his uniform tunic darkened with blood. His service revolver lay near his right hand, the metal gleaming dully in the morning light. "Good God!" Lake breathed, rushing forward before Finn could stop him. "Inspector, sir." But even from a distance, it was clear that Inspector Slack was beyond any earthly assistance. Major Finn, his military training taking precedence, quickly assessed the scene with a practice of a man who had seen violent death before. "Don't touch anything," he commanded sharply. "This is a crime scene now. We need to telephone for Dr. Hawk immediately." Lake stood frozen, staring down at the man who'd been his mentor and superior for so many years. The inspector's face was peaceful, almost serene, as if death had come without warning or struggle. But the blood on his tunic and the position of the revolver told a different story entirely. "It looks like—" Lake began, then stopped, unable to voice the obvious conclusion. "Suicide," Finn finished grimly. "Though we must not jump to conclusions, Dr. Haddock will need to examine the body before we can determine anything with certainty." While they waited for the doctor to arrive, Finn conducted a preliminary examination of the scene, careful not to disturb any potential evidence. The positioning of the body, the location of the weapon, the absence of any obvious signs of struggle, all seemed to point toward a man who had taken his own life in a moment of despair. But there were details that troubled the mage's military mind. The distance between Slack's body and the revolver seemed greater than one might expect if the weapon had simply fallen from a dying man's grasp. And there was something about the way the inspector's uniform had been arranged that suggested careful positioning rather than the random collapse of a suicide. Dr. Haddock arrived within 30 minutes, his medical bag in hand and his usually cheerful demeanor subdued by the circumstances. He was a man who had served the community for over 20 years, and the sight of Inspector Slack's body clearly affected him deeply. "Terrible business," Haddock muttered, kneeling beside the body and beginning his preliminary examination. "Dermat was always such a steady man. I would never have expected." His words trailed off as he examined the wound more closely, his experienced fingers noting details that would escape a layman's notice. After several minutes of careful study, he looked up at Major Finn with a troubled expression. "This wasn't suicide," he announced with quiet certainty. "The powder burns around the wound are too dispersed, the halo pattern too wide. This shot was fired from a distance of at least 10 feet, possibly more. No man could shoot himself from such a range." The implications of Dr. Haddock's pronouncement settled over the scene like a dark cloud. If Inspector Slack had not taken his own life, then someone else had pulled the trigger. Someone who had lured him to this isolated location in the early hours of the morning and killed him in cold blood. Sergeant Lake felt his legs grow weak beneath him. Murder was a word that carried terrible weight in a place like St. Mary Me, where violent crime was almost unknown. And the fact that the victim was Inspector Slack, a man respected throughout the county for his integrity and dedication, made the crime seem all the more horrific. "We need to examine how the killer gained access," Finn said, his voice taking on the crisp authority of a man accustomed to command. "Lake, you mentioned that you have a spare key to the gate chain." Lake nodded numbly, fishing in his pocket for his key ring. The spare key to the range was there, where it had always been, but as he examined the chain more closely, a disturbing realization began to dawn on him. "Sir," he said slowly, "this chain has been unlocked with a key, not cut or forced, and apart from myself and Inspector Slack, no one else should have had access." The morning sun was climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the abandoned firing range and illuminating a scene that would haunt all who witnessed it. Inspector Dermot Slack, the man who had dedicated his life to uncovering the truth behind criminal acts, had himself become the victim of a carefully planned murder. And somewhere in St. Mary Me, a killer walked free, believing that the perfect crime had been committed in the perfect location, far from prying eyes and suspicious minds. But the killer had not reckoned with the fact that in a village like St. Mary Me, secrets had a way of revealing themselves, and truth like murder would out. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notes powder on a police medal. News of Inspector Slack's death spread through St. Mary Me with the swiftness that only shocking events can achieve, in a small village. By mid-morning, the very air seemed to vibrate with whispered conversations and the kind of subdued excitement that accompanies tragedy. Miss Marple, having observed the departure of Major Finn and Sergeant Lake earlier, was not entirely surprised when Dr. Haddock's motor car came racing back through the village with unusual urgency. She was cutting late roses when Lady Bantry arrived at her garden gate, her face pale beneath her carefully applied powder, and her usual composure quite shattered. "Jane, my dear," Lady Bantry said breathlessly, "have you heard? The most dreadful thing has happened. Inspector Slack is dead. They found him at the old firing range this morning." Miss Marple set down her secrets with deliberate care, though her pulse had quickened considerably. "Dead? But we saw him only last evening, and he seemed quite well, if somewhat preoccupied." "That's just it," Lady Bantry continued, lowering her voice to the conspiratorial tone that tragic events seem to inspire. Dr. Haddock says, "It wasn't natural causes. They're saying it was murder, Jane. Murder in St. Mary-me again." The weight of that word seemed to settle between them like a physical presence. Murder was no stranger to their quiet village, but it never became easier to accept, never lost its power to shatter the comfortable routines of daily life. "I see," Miss Marple said quietly, her mind already beginning to work through the implications. "And have they any idea who might have done such a terrible thing?" "That's what makes it so puzzling," Lady Bantry replied. "The range was locked, and only Sergeant Lake had a spare key, but surely no one suspects Lake of harming his own inspector. They've worked together for years." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, remembering the dynamics she had observed at the previous evening's dinner. Sergeant Lake's devotion to Inspector Slack had seemed genuine enough, but she had learned over the years that the human heart was capable of concealing depths of deception that could surprise even the most astute observer. "I wonder," she said carefully, "if they would permit me to pay my respects. Inspector Slack was, after all, a man who served our community faithfully for many years." Lady Bantry looked somewhat surprised by this request. "I suppose it couldn't hurt to ask. Dr. Haddock is making arrangements for the body to be taken to the mortuary. Perhaps, if we spoke to him." The mortuary in the nearby market town was a sober establishment that Miss Marple had occasion to visit more often than she might have wished over the years. Dr. Haddock, when approached, was initially hesitant to allow civilian visitors, but Miss Marple's reputation for discretion and her previous assistance in delicate matters eventually persuaded him to grant her request. "I must ask you to be very careful not to disturb anything," Dr. Haddock cautioned as he led her into the cool, antiseptic-scented room where Inspector Slack's body lay beneath a white sheet. "The police will want to conduct their own examination, and any contamination of the evidence could prove problematic." Miss Marple assured him of her understanding and approached the covered form with the respectful solemnity that such moments demanded. When Dr. Haddock drew back the sheet to reveal the inspector's face and upper body, she found herself looking down at a man who appeared remarkably peaceful in death. His weathered features relaxed in a way she had rarely seen during his lifetime. Inspector Slack's uniform tunic had been left exactly as it was found, the dark stain of blood marking the fatal wound, but not obscuring the array of medals and insignia that spoke of his years of dedicated service. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across these symbols of duty and honor, noting each familiar decoration, with the attention to detail that had become second nature to her. It was when her gaze settled on the police long service medal that she noticed something that made her lean forward slightly, her trained eye focusing on what appeared to be a fine dusting of grayish powder on the ribbon from which the medal hung. "Dr. Haddock," she said quietly. Might I ask you to look at something? The doctor moved to stand beside her, following her pointing finger to the metal ribbon. What is it, Miss Marple? I'm afraid I don't see anything unusual. The gray powder on the ribbon, she explained patiently. It's quite faint, but if you look closely in this light, you can see the residue quite clearly. Dr. Haydock adjusted his spectacles and peered more closely at the ribbon. After a moment, he straightened with a puzzled expression. You're quite right. There does appear to be some sort of dust or powder there. But what could it be? Miss Marple's mind was already working through the possibilities, drawing upon the vast store of practical knowledge she had accumulated over decades of village life. If I'm not mistaken, Doctor, that appears to be graphite powder, the kind used to lubricate mechanical equipment. Graphite? Dr. Haydock looked even more puzzled. But what would Inspector Slack have been doing with graphite? And why would it be on his metal ribbon of all places? That, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, is indeed the question. You see, graphite is commonly used to grease the cables and pulleys of mechanical systems that must operate smoothly. At the firing range, for instance, the target trolley system would require regular lubrication to function properly. The implications of her observation began to sink in as she continued her examination of the inspector's uniform. The graphite residue was concentrated specifically on the long service metal ribbon, suggesting that Inspector Slack had been in close contact with the target trolley mechanism shortly before his death. But, according to Sergeant Lake, Dr. Haydock amused, Inspector Slack had no reason to be examining the target equipment. The range has been largely abandoned for years. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her pale blue eyes reflecting the careful thought process that made her such an effective solver of puzzles. Precisely, Doctor, which suggests that Inspector Slack was at the firing range for a purpose that we have not yet understood, something that required him to handle or examine the target trolley system. She moved around to examine the inspector's hands, noting the condition of his fingernails and palms. There, too, she found traces of the telltale gray residue, confirming that he had indeed been in direct contact with lubricated mechanical equipment. This changes things considerably, Dr. Haddock observed. If Inspector Slack was actively examining the range equipment, it suggests he went there for a specific purpose, not simply to meet someone or to contemplate ending his life. Miss Marple carefully committed every detail to memory. Knowing that in cases of murder, the smallest observations often prove to be the most significant. The graphite powder on Inspector Slack's metal ribbon was more than just an interesting anomaly. It was evidence that the inspector had been engaged in some sort of investigation or examination of the firing range facilities. But what had he been looking for? And had his search somehow led to his death? As they prepared to leave the mortuary, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the previous evening's dinner and the mysterious envelope that had so clearly disturbed Inspector Slack. The timing seemed too coincidental to ignore. Within hours of receiving that buff-cold letter, the inspector was dead at the abandoned firing range, his uniform bearing evidence of contact with equipment. He should have had no reason to examine Dr. Haddock, she said, as they walked back toward his motor car. I don't suppose you noticed whether Inspector Slack was carrying any papers when his body was discovered? The doctor shook his head. Major Finn mentioned finding nothing unusual in his pockets. No wallet, no papers, nothing but his keys and a pocket watch that had stopped. Another interesting detail, Miss Marple thought. A man's pocket watch stopping could be purely coincidental, but in her experience, coincidences in murder cases were often anything but coincidental. As they drove back toward St. Mary-Me, Miss Marple gazed out at the familiar countryside and reflected on the growing complexity of Inspector Slack's death. The graphite powder, the stopped watch, the mysterious envelope from the previous evening, all seemed to be pieces of a puzzle that was far more intricate than a simple case of murder might initially suggest. Somewhere in the quiet village ahead, a killer was probably congratulating himself on having committed the perfect crime. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that there was no such thing as a perfect crime, only crimes where the evidence had not yet been properly understood. Chapter 4. The Sergeant with Two Stopwatches. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the village green as Miss Marple made her way toward the police station. The discovery of the graphite powder on Inspector Slack's medal had raised questions that demanded answers, and she felt certain that Sergeant Lake, now acting as the senior officer, might possess information that could shed light on the inspector's final hours. The station house presented a picture of subdued activity, with Constable Locke manning the front desk, while Lake presumably dealt with the administrative burdens that violent death invariably created. Miss Marple had always found police stations to be rather melancholy places, filled as they were with the detritus of human weakness and failure. But today, the atmosphere seemed particularly heavy with unspoken grief. "Miss Marple," Constable Locke said, rising respectfully as she entered terrible business about the inspector. "Just terrible. Is there something I can help you with?" "I was hoping to speak with Sergeant Lake if he has a moment," she replied gently. "I know this must be a very difficult time for all of you." Loach nodded gravely and disappeared into the back office, returning shortly with Lake, whose face bore the strain of a man thrust suddenly into responsibilities he had not expected to assume so soon. His uniform was slightly rumpled, and there was a weariness about his movements that spoke of a sleepless night and a day filled with unwelcome duties. "Miss Marple," Lake said, attempting to summon his professional manner despite his obvious distress. "I understand you've been to see Dr. Haydock about the inspector. I hope you'll forgive me if I ask why." Miss Marple settled herself in the chair he offered, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. "Inspector Slack served this community faithfully for many years. Sergeant Lake. I felt it was only proper to pay my respects, and I must confess I was curious about certain aspects of the case." Lake's expression grew cautious. "What sort of aspects?" "Well, for instance, the matter of timing," she said thoughtfully. "I understand that Major Finn suggested the early morning expedition to the firing range. Might I ask how he knew to contact you so promptly?" "He didn't exactly explain," Lake admitted, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Said he wanted to conduct some ballistic tests for his home office report. Seemed urgent about it, though I couldn't understand why. We'd arranged to meet at 7 o'clock. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And you arrived at the range when just past 7, maybe 10 minutes after, I'd say." Lake paused, a troubled expression crossing his features. "Though I must admit, Miss Marple, that I was running a bit behind schedule. My pocket watch seemed to be gaining time, and I got confused about the exact hour." "Your pocket watch?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "How unusual. Timepieces generally lose time rather than gain it, don't they?" Lake reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a silver watch, examining it with evident puzzlement. "That's what's so strange about it. This morning it was running 14 minutes fast. I've never had trouble with it before." He handed the watch to Miss Marple, who examined it with the careful attention she gave to all mechanical objects. It was a well-made piece, clearly expensive, with an inscription on the back that read, "To H. Time and Tide D's. A gift from Inspector Slack," she inquired mildly. "Yes, for my 10th anniversary with the force," he said. "A good policeman always knows the correct time." Lake's voice carried a note of fond remembrance. "He was very particular about punctuality. The inspector said, it was like a barrister, keeping precedence essential to the job. Miss Marple turned the watch over in her hands, noting its weight and quality. How curious that it should malfunction just at this particular time. You mentioned it was 14 minutes fast. That's right. I noticed it when I woke up this morning. Thought perhaps I'd overwhelmed it. Lake frowned. But that doesn't usually make a watch run fast, does it? Indeed not, Miss Marple agreed, returning the watch to him. Sergeant Lake, might I ask whether you carry more than one timepiece? The question seemed to surprise him. More than one? Well, yes, actually I do. There's my service watch for timing drills and exercises. Why, do you ask? Would you mind showing me the other watch? Lake hesitated for a moment, then reached into another pocket and produced a second timepiece. This one, a more utilitarian model, with a plain face and sturdy construction, Miss Marple examined this one as well, noting that it showed the correct time according to the station clock on the wall. 2 watches, she mused. How very thorough of you, Sergeant. The drill watch was a necessity, Lake explained somewhat defensively. We use it for timing exercises, measuring response times, that sort of thing. The inspector insisted on precision in all our training activities. Miss Marple's mind was working through the implications of this discovery. 2 watches, one running 14 minutes fast, given by a man who prized punctuality above almost all other virtues. The timing of Inspector Slack's death suddenly seemed far more complex than it had initially appeared. Sergeant Lake, she said carefully. When you say your gift watch was 14 minutes fast this morning, are you quite certain it was correct yesterday evening? Lake considered this question seriously. I believe so. I checked it against the church clock when I left the dinner last night, and it seemed to be keeping proper time then. So, the gain occurred overnight. It must have done, though I can't imagine what would cause such a thing. Miss Marple could imagine several possibilities, none of them particularly innocent. A watch that suddenly gained 14 minutes suggested external interference, the sort of careful manipulation that might be employed by someone who needed to establish a false timeline. Tell me, Sergeant, she continued, was Inspector Slack himself particular about timekeeping? Did he carry a pocket watch? Oh, yes, always. A beautiful gold piece that belonged to his father. He consulted it constantly during the day, said it helped him keep track of witness statements and interview times. Lake's expression darkened. I suppose it stopped when it happened. The mention of the stopped watch confirmed what Dr. Haydock had told her earlier. Another timepiece affected by the events of the previous night. Another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit the simple narrative of a man walking to his death at the firing range. As Miss Marple prepared to take her leave, she reflected on the curious matter of Sergeant Lake's 2 watches. The gift watch running fast, the drill watch keeping perfect time, and somewhere in the background, Inspector Slack's gold watch that had stopped forever. In her experience, when timepieces began behaving strangely in a murder case, it usually meant that someone was attempting to manipulate the sequence of events. But who would have had access to Lake's watch, and why would they want to make it run fast? The answers, she suspected, lay somewhere in the complex relationships between the men who had gathered for that farewell dinner. Relationships that might not have been as straightforward as they had appeared on the surface. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple found herself thinking about time and its curious properties, how it could be stretched or compressed by human need, how it could be made to lie as effectively as any witness, and how the truth had a way of revealing itself regardless of the deceptions that surrounded it. Chapter 5. Footprints that double back over chalk. The morning following Miss Marple's conversation with Sergeant Lake dawned gray and threatening, with heavy clouds rolling in from the west and the promise of rain hanging in the air. It was the sort of weather that seemed to mirror the mood that had settled over St. Mary since Inspector Slack's death. Oppressive and full of unspoken tensions, Miss Marple had spent a restless night pondering the curious matter of the sergeant's 2 watches, and what their condition might reveal about the sequence of events at the firing range. She was taking her morning tea when Lady Bantry arrived, her face flushed with excitement, and her usual composure quite abandoned. "Jane, my dear, you must come at once," Lady Bantry announced breathlessly. "Major Finn has asked me to accompany him to the firing range. He says he needs witnesses for some sort of examination, and he particularly requested that you be present." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "How very interesting. Did the Major explain what sort of examination he had in mind?" "Something about footprints, I believe. He says the rain that began last night has created perfect conditions for preserving evidence that might otherwise have been overlooked." Lady Bantry paused to catch her breath. "He's waiting outside in his motor car." Within minutes, Miss Marple found herself seated beside Lady Bantry in Major Finn's vehicle, being conveyed once again toward the abandoned firing range. The Major's manner was even more brisk than usual, and there was an intensity about his movements that suggested he had made some significant discovery. "The weather has been most cooperative," Finn explained as they navigated the narrow country lanes. "The light rain that fell during the night has turned the chalk soil around the range into something approaching modeling clay, perfect for preserving impressions that might tell us something about Inspector Slack's final hours." When they arrived at the range, Miss Marple could see immediately what the Major meant. The chalky soil, which had been dry and dusty on the morning of the discovery, had been transformed by the overnight rain into a pale adhesive paste that held impressions with remarkable clarity. Sergeant Lake was already present, looking somewhat uncomfortable at being summoned back to the scene of his superior's death. Constable Locke stood nearby, notebook at the ready, his earnest face reflecting the gravity of the proceedings. "Now then," Major Finn announced, producing a magnifying glass from his coat pocket, "let us see what story the ground has to tell us." He led them to a section of the path leading from the gate toward the firing positions, where the soft chalk mud had preserved a clear record of recent passage. Miss Marple found herself studying the impressions with the same careful attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. "2 distinct sets of footprints," Finn observed, kneeling beside the clearest impressions, both made by regulation police boots, but of slightly different sizes and tread patterns. Miss Marple leaned forward to examine the prints more closely. Even to her untrained eye, it was evident that 2 different people had walked along this path, their footsteps overlapping in some places and diverging in others. "The larger prints match Inspector Slack's boots," Sergeant Lake said quietly, his voice carrying a note of sadness. "I helped him choose those particular boots 3 years ago when his old ones finally wore out." "And the smaller prints?" Major Finn inquired, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Lake examined the impressions with evident reluctance. "They appear to match my own boots, sir, though I can't say I remember the exact path I took when we discovered the body." Miss Marple followed the trail of footprints with growing interest, noting how they diverged and converged along the path. But it was when they reached the firing positions themselves that the most curious pattern emerged. "How very odd," she murmured, studying a particular section where the chalk mud had captured an especially clear sequence of impressions. "These larger prints, Inspector Slack's boots, appear to walk in a circle near the target trolley, then head back along the path." Major Finn nodded grimly. "Precisely what I observed. The inspector's footprints show that he walked to the target line, spent some time examining the trolley mechanism, then began to return toward the gate. "But look here," Miss Marple continued, pointing to where the two sets of prints converged and overlapped. "The smaller prints, Sergeant Lake's, appear to follow the same route, but they overlap the inspector's prints in several places. The implications of this observation settled over the group like a physical weight. If Sergeant Lake's footprints overlapped those of Inspector Slack, it suggested that Lake had walked the same path after the inspector, not before him, as might be expected if they had arrived together." "That's impossible," Lake protested, his face pale in the gray morning light. "Major Finn and I arrived together and found the inspector's body immediately. I never walked to the target line." Major Finn's expression had grown increasingly stern as he continued his examination of the ground. "The evidence suggests otherwise, Sergeant. These impressions were made before the rain began, which means they date from yesterday morning." At the latest, Miss Marple continued to study the pattern of footprints, her mind working through the possible explanations for what they were seeing. The circular pattern of Inspector Slack's boots near the target trolley confirmed her earlier deduction about the graphite powder on his medal. He had indeed been examining the mechanical equipment before his death, but the overlapping pattern of the two sets of prints told a more complex story. If Lake's boots had left impressions that overlapped Slack's, it suggested that the sergeant had walked the same route at different time, possibly when the ground conditions were similar enough to preserve both sets of marks. "Sergeant Lake," she said gently, "are you quite certain you have not visited this range recently? Perhaps for an inspection or to check on the security?" Lake shook his head emphatically. "I haven't been here for months, Miss Marple, not since my last official inspection of the facilities." "Yet the footprints suggest otherwise," Major Finn observed coldly. "And there's something else that troubles me about this pattern." He moved to a section where the prints were particularly clear, pointing with his walking stick to a specific area. "These impressions show that someone walked from the firing line back toward the gate, following almost exactly the same route as Inspector Slack's return journey." Miss Marple studied the overlapping prints with growing understanding. The story they told was not one of a chance discovery by an innocent colleague, but of someone who had followed the same path as the victim, possibly at a different time, possibly with very different intentions. The rain began to fall again as they completed their examination, the droplets creating tiny craters in the chalk mud and threatening to wash away the evidence they had uncovered. But the damage from an investigative standpoint was already done. The footprints had revealed that the official version of events, the story of Major Finn and Sergeant Lake arriving together to discover the body, was incomplete at best. Someone had walked that path before them, someone whose boots matched those of Sergeant Lake, someone who had followed in Inspector Slack's footsteps with purposes that remained disturbingly unclear. As they prepared to leave the range, Miss Marple found herself wondering about the true sequence of events that had led to Inspector Slack's death. The footprints in the chalk mud had provided answers to some questions, but they had raised far more troubling ones in return. Truth, she reflected, had a way of leaving its mark, no matter how carefully one tried to cover one's tracks. Chapter 6. A dictaphone still humming in the evidence cupboard. The discovery of the overlapping footprints had cast a pea of suspicion over the investigation that seemed to affect everyone involved. Miss Marple had noticed how Sergeant Lake's manner had grown increasingly strained in the days following Major Finn's examination of the chalk mud, and how Constable Locke appeared to be walking on eggshells whenever he was in his superior's presence. It was on the third day after Inspector Slack's death that Constable Locke made the discovery that would transform the case entirely. Miss Marple learned of it when the young constable appeared at her cottage door in the early evening. his face flushed with excitement and anxiety in equal measure. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I didn't know who else to turn to. I found something at the station, something that Sergeant Lake doesn't know about yet, and I'm not sure what I should do." Miss Marple invited him in and settled him in a sitting room with a cup of tea, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup to his lips. Whatever Constable Locke had discovered, it had clearly shaken him considerably. "Take your time, Constable," she said gently. "Begin at the beginning and tell me exactly what has happened." Locke sat down his teacup and took a deep breath. "Well, you see, Sergeant Lake asked me to clear out Inspector Slack's desk and filing cabinets, sort through his papers, organize the case files, that sort of thing. It's a job that needs doing, and with the sergeant being so busy with the investigation." He paused, seeming to gather his courage before continuing. "I was going through the filing cabinet behind the inspector's desk, the one where he kept all the evidence from closed cases. You know how meticulous he was about keeping records. Always said you never knew when old evidence might prove useful in a new case." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Inspector Slack's attention to detail had been legendary throughout the constabulary, and his filing system was considered a model of organization. "I was pulling out files from the back of the bottom drawer when I heard this faint humming sound," Locke continued. "At first I thought it might be the heating pipes, or perhaps some electrical equipment. But when I listened more carefully, I realized it was coming from behind the files themselves." The unconstable's excitement was growing as he recounted his discovery. "I moved all the files out of the way, and there, tucked into the very back corner of the drawer, he had indeed been examining the mechanical equipment before his death, but the overlapping pattern of the two sets of prints told a more complex story. If Lakes's boots had left impressions that overlapped Slack's, it suggested that the sergeant had walked the same route at different time, possibly when the ground conditions were similar enough to preserve both sets of marks." "Sergeant Lake," she said gently, "are you quite certain you have not visited this range recently? Perhaps for an inspection, or to check on the security?" Lake shook his head emphatically. "I haven't been here for months, Miss Marple. Not since my last official inspection of the facilities." "Yet the footprints suggest otherwise," Major Finn observed coldly. "And there's something else that troubles me about this pattern." He moved to a section where the prints were particularly clear, pointing with his walking stick to a specific area. "These impressions show that someone walked from the firing line back toward the gate, following almost exactly the same route as Inspector Slack's return journey." Miss Marple studied the overlapping prints with growing understanding. The story they told was not one of a chance discovery by an innocent colleague, but of someone who had followed the same path as the victim, possibly at a different time, possibly with very different intentions. The rain began to fall again as they completed their examination, the droplets creating tiny craters in the chalk mud and threatening to wash away the evidence they had uncovered. But the damage from an investigative standpoint was already done. The footprints had revealed that the official version of events, the story of Major Finn and Sergeant Lake arriving together to discover the body, was incomplete at best. Someone had walked that path before them, someone whose boots matched those of Sergeant Lake, someone who had followed in Inspector Slack's footsteps with purposes that remained disturbingly unclear. As they prepared to leave the range, Miss Marple found herself wondering about the true sequence of events that had led to Inspector Slack's death. The footprints in the chalk mud had provided answers to some questions, but they had raised far more troubling ones in return. Truth, she reflected, had a way of leaving its mark, no matter how carefully one tried to cover one's tracks. Chapter 6. A dictaphone still humming in the evidence cupboard. The discovery of the overlapping footprints had cast a pall of suspicion over the investigation that seemed to affect everyone involved. Miss Marple had noticed how Sergeant Lakes's manner had grown increasingly strained in the days following Major Finn's examination of the chalk mud, and how Constable Locke appeared to be walking on eggshells whenever he was in his superior's presence. It was on the third day after Inspector Slack's death that Constable Locke made the discovery that would transform the case entirely. Miss Marple learned of it when the young constable appeared at her cottage door in the early evening, his face flushed with excitement and anxiety in equal measure. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but I didn't know who else to turn to. I found something at the station, something that Sergeant Lake doesn't know about yet, and I'm not sure what I should do." Miss Marple invited him in and settled him in a sitting room with a cup of tea, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the cup to his lips. Whatever Constable Locke had discovered, it had clearly shaken him considerably. "Take your time, Constable," she said gently. "Begin at the beginning and tell me exactly what has happened." Locke sat down his teacup and took a deep breath. "Well, you see, Sergeant Lake asked me to clear out Inspector Slack's desk and filing cabinets, sort through his papers, organize the case files, that sort of thing. It's a job that needs doing, and with the sergeant being so busy with the investigation." He paused, seeming to gather his courage before continuing. "I was going through the filing cabinet behind the inspector's desk, the one where he kept all the evidence from closed cases. You know how meticulous he was about keeping records. Always said you never knew when old evidence might prove useful in a new case." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Inspector Slack's attention to detail had been legendary throughout the constabulary, and his filing system was considered a model of organization. I was pulling out files from the back of the bottom drawer when I heard this faint humming sound, Locke continued. "At first I thought it might be the heating pipes, or perhaps some electrical equipment, but when I listened more carefully, I realized it was coming from behind the files themselves." The unconstable's excitement was growing as he recounted his discovery. "I moved all the files out of the way, and there, tucked into the very back corner of the drawer, the inspector obviously hid that machine for a reason, and if he was investigating ammunition theft. You're wondering if Sergeant Lake might be involved in whatever the inspector discovered," Miss Marple finished for him. "I don't want to believe it," Locke said miserably. "Lake has always been a good officer, and he seemed genuinely fond of the inspector. But the footprints, and now this recording that mentions ammunition discrepancies." Miss Marple could understand the young man's dilemma. The evidence was pointing in disturbing directions, suggesting that Inspector Slack's death might be connected to corruption within the very force he had served so faithfully. The dictaphone, humming quietly in its hiding place for days after its owner's death, had preserved evidence that could reshape the entire investigation, but it had also raised questions that would be far more difficult to answer than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 7. Midnight in the Record Cellar. The discovery of the dictaphone had left Miss Marple with a profound sense of unease that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. The recording's implications were far too serious to ignore, yet the proper course of action remained frustratingly unclear. It was Constable Locke who suggested the solution that would ultimately lead them to the heart of the mystery. "Miss Marple," he said, when he visited her cottage the following evening, "I've been thinking about what the inspector said on that recording, all those references to forged armory logs and missing ammunition. If there really has been corruption at the station, there might be evidence of it in the records." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her pale blue eyes reflecting careful consideration. "What sort of evidence did you have in mind, Constable?" "Well," All the station diaries are kept in the record cellar beneath the building. Years and years of daily logs, ammunition tallies, equipment inventories, that sort of thing. If someone has been falsifying documents, the originals might still be down there. The logic of this suggestion was undeniable. Police stations, by their very nature, were repositories of meticulous record-keeping, and even the most careful forger might have overlooked some detail in the archives. "I take it you're proposing to examine these records?" Miss Marple inquired gently, Locke flushed slightly. "I know it's not exactly proper procedure, but given the circumstances, the thing is, I can't very well ask Sergeant Lake for permission if he might be involved in whatever the inspector discovered." Miss Marple understood the young man's dilemma perfectly. The dictaphone recording had created a situation where normal channels of authority could not be trusted, where the very people who should be investigating might themselves be implicated. "When were you thinking of conducting this examination?" she asked. "Tonight, if you'd be willing to accompany me. This station is usually empty after 10 o'clock, and I have keys to all the areas with you there as a witness." Miss Marple found herself agreeing to this regular but potentially necessary investigation. The truth about Inspector Slack's death seemed to lie somewhere in the labyrinth of official documents, and if Constable Locke was willing to risk his career to uncover it, she felt obligated to assist him. At 11 that evening, Miss Marple found herself following Constable Locke through the darkened corridors of the police station. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the empty building, and the familiar daytime sounds of administrative activity had been replaced by the subtle creaks and sigh that old buildings make in the hours of darkness. The record cellar was reached by a narrow staircase that descended beneath the main floor of the station. Locke's torch beam revealed rows of filing cabinets and document boxes stretching back into the shadows, a testament to decades of careful record-keeping. "The station diaries are kept in chronological order," Locke explained in a whisper, leading her toward a particular section of shelving. "Each month gets its own volume, and they're supposed to be permanent records that can never be altered." They have been searching through the files for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard the sound that made them both freeze in terror. Footsteps, careful and deliberate, were descending the cellar stairs. Miss Marple and Constable Locke quickly extinguished their torch and crouched behind a bank of filing cabinets, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused as if the newcomer was listening for any sign of detection. A faint beam of light appeared, sweeping slowly across the cellar as whoever had entered began to move among the files. Miss Marple could hear the soft rustle of papers being moved, and the occasional quiet thud of a drawer being closed. The light moved closer to their hiding place, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of the figure holding it. To her surprise, it was Agnes Q, the civilian clerk, who'd been present at Inspector Slack's farewell dinner. But this was not the quiet, unremarkable woman they had seen that evening. This Agnes Cutter moved with purpose and determination, and in her free hand she carried something that glinted metallically in the torchlight. Miss Marple's sharp eyes identified the object as a razor blade, the sort used for precision cutting of documents. Agnes was clearly here for the same purpose as themselves, to examine or alter the station records, but her intentions appeared to be far more destructive. They watched in fascination as Agnes made her way to a specific filing cabinet and began searching through its contents with the familiarity of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. When she found the document she sought, she carefully removed it from its folder and began to make precise cuts with the razor blade. It was at this moment that Constable Locke made his decision. Rising from their hiding place with more courage than Miss Marple might have expected, he switched on his torch and called out in his official voice, "Agnes, you're under arrest for tampering with official documents." Agnes spun around, her face a mask of shock and terror in the sudden glare of the torch beam. The razor blade clattered to the floor, and the document she'd been altering fluttered after it. "Constable Locke!" she gasped. I can explain." "I'm sure you can," Locke replied grimly, moving forward to restrain her. "But first, I think you'd better tell us exactly what you've been doing down here." Agnes's composure crumbled entirely under the pressure of discovery. "I was only following orders," she blurted out. "Sergeant Lake told me I had to remove that page before anyone else saw it. He said it would ruin everything if it came to light." Miss Marple emerged from the shadows, her presence adding weight to the confrontation. "What page, Miss Cutter? What is it that Sergeant Lake was so anxious to conceal?" Agnes looked between them with a desperate expression of someone who had been caught in an act she knew to be wrong, but had felt powerless to refuse. The armory inspection records from 3 months ago. The page that shows the ammunition tallies were falsified. She gestured toward the document on the floor. Inspector Slack discovered the discrepancies last week. He knew that someone had been stealing ammunition and selling it to private gun clubs. The logs showed everything balanced, but the physical count was short by hundreds of rounds. Constable Locke picked up the document and examined it by torchlight. Even in the dim illumination, the evidence of forgery was apparent. Someone had very carefully altered the ammunition tallies to conceal systematic theft over several months. "And Sergeant Lake ordered you to destroy this evidence?" Miss Marple asked gently. Agnes nodded miserably. "He said it was the only way to protect everyone involved, that if the Home Office found out about the missing ammunition, it would destroy the reputation of the entire station." But as Miss Marple studied the woman's face in the torchlight, she began to suspect that Agnes Cutter's role in this affair was far more complex than simple obedience to superior orders. The skill with which she had located and begun to alter the document suggested familiarity with such activities, and her presence in the record cellar at midnight spoke of someone with her own reasons for wanting certain information to disappear. The truth about Inspector Slack's death was beginning to emerge from the shadows, but like so many truths, it was proving to be far more complicated and disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. Chapter 8. The station diary with one page glued shut. The arrest of Agnes Cutter had created a situation that required immediate attention from higher authorities. By morning, Major Finn had been summoned from his lodgings, and the small interview room at the police station had become the center of an increasingly complex investigation. Miss Marple, having been present at Agnes's arrest, found herself officially requested to provide testimony about the events in the record cellar. She arrived at the station to find an atmosphere of barely controlled tension, with Sergeant Lake looking haggarded, and Constable Locke maintaining the rigid posture of a man trying to do his duty, despite considerable personal cost. "Miss Marple," Major Finn said when she entered the interview room, "I understand you witnessed Miss Cutter's attempt to destroy official documents. I hope you can shed some light on this extraordinary affair." Agnes sat at the small table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and her eyes red-rimmed from what had clearly been a sleepless night. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, and there was something in her expression that suggested relief at seeing a familiar face. "I've been explaining to Major Finn about the ammunition discrepancies," Agnes said quietly, "about how Sergeant Lake asked me to alter the records to cover up the shortages." Miss Marple took the chair offered to her and studied the documents that had been arranged on the table. The page that Agnes had been attempting to destroy was there, along with several other records that appeared to show a pattern of systematic falsification. "Miss Cutter," she said gently, "when you say that Sergeant Lake asked you to alter the records, are you quite certain that he was acting on his own initiative?" Agnes looked confused by the question. I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple. Well, forgery of official documents is a very serious matter. It seems unlikely that someone would undertake such risks without compelling reasons. Was Sergeant Lake perhaps being pressured by someone else? Major Finn leaned forward with interest. That's an excellent point. Miss Marple Mystery. Did Sergeant Lake ever mention why these alterations were necessary? Agnes hesitated for a long moment before answering. He said that if the ammunition shortages were discovered, it would mean the end of his career, that Inspector Slack had been asking questions, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing came to light. Miss Marple examined the documents more carefully, noting the dates and the nature of the alterations. The pattern that emerged was one of gradual escalation, beginning with small discrepancies and growing to involve hundreds of rounds of missing ammunition. This page here, she said, pointing to a particular entry, shows an armory inspection signed by both Inspector Slack and Sergeant Lake 3 months ago. But according to what you told us last night, this signature was forged. Agnes nodded miserably. Inspector Slack was in hospital that week with his appendix operation. I remember because his sister Edith was so worried about him. But the inspection had to be completed for the quarterly report. So, Sergeant Lake asked me to add the inspector's signature. The significance of this revelation was not lost on anyone present. If Inspector Slack's signature had been forged on official documents, it provided a clear motive for murder. A man facing exposure for corruption might well resort to violence to protect himself, but Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain inconsistencies in the story that was emerging. The dictaphone recording had captured Inspector Slack speaking of Lake in trustful terms, hardly the words of a man about to expose a corrupt colleague. Mister, she said thoughtfully, you mentioned that Inspector Slack was asking questions about the ammunition shortages. Did he ever speak to you directly about these matters? Not exactly, Agnes replied, but I could tell he was suspicious. He'd taken to checking the physical inventory against the written records, something he'd never done before, and he'd started asking about specific dates and quantities in a way that made me very nervous. Major Finn consulted his notes. When did you first notice Inspector Slack becoming suspicious about the ammunition records? About 2 weeks ago, he came into the office one morning with that buff envelope, the one he received at his farewell dinner, and his whole demeanor changed. He spent the rest of the day going through old files and cross-referencing documents. Miss Marple's interest sharpened at this reference to the mysterious envelope. Are you saying that Inspector Slack's investigation began after he received that letter? Oh, yes, definitely. Before that evening, he'd shown no particular interest in the ammunition records, but something in that envelope must have alerted him to the discrepancies. This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. If the envelope had contained information that prompted Inspector Slack's investigation, then his death might not have been the result of a gradual discovery, but rather the consequence of specific intelligence received from an outside source. Miss Cutter, Miss Marple continued, in all your work altering these records, did you ever see or handle the original documents before they were changed? Agnes looked puzzled by the question. Of course, I had to know what the real figures were before I could adjust them to match Sergeant Lake's requirements. And did you keep copies of the original entries? Well, no. Sergeant Lake was very specific about that. He said all evidence of the true figures had to be destroyed to protect everyone involved. Miss Marple reached across the table and picked up one of the station diaries, a thick volume bound in official blue covers. As she flipped through its pages, she noticed something that made her pause. How curious, she murmured, examining a particular section more closely. This page appears to have been glued shut. Major Finn leaned over to see what she had discovered. The page in question had indeed been sealed along its edges with what appeared to be library paste, creating a permanent closure that would require deliberate effort to open. "Miss Cutter," he said sharply, "do you know anything about this sealed page?" Agnes's face went even paler than it had been. "That was one of Sergeant Lake's requirements. He said some entries were too dangerous to leave accessible, even after alteration. Better to seal them permanently than risk discovery." With careful precision, Major Finn used his penknife to open the sealed page. What he found there confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the true nature of the case. The original entry preserved beneath the glue showed the actual ammunition count from the inspection 3 months earlier. But more importantly, it showed Inspector Slack's genuine signature, along with a note in his handwriting expressing concern about discrepancies in the inventory. This proves that Inspector Slack was aware of the problems 3 months ago, Major Finn observed. The question is why he waited so long to act on his suspicions. Miss Marple studied the handwriting with the careful attention she brought to all forms of evidence. Something about the inspector's note troubled her, though she could not immediately identify what it was. The sealed page had revealed new layers of complexity in a case that seemed to grow more intricate with each discovery. But she could not shake the feeling that they were still missing some crucial element that would make sense of all the contradictions and inconsistencies. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the details that others might overlook, waiting to be discovered by someone patient enough to see the patterns that connected all the scattered pieces of evidence. Chapter 9. 2 bullet holes, but only 1 bullet. The revelation of the sealed diary page had prompted Major Finn to order a more thorough examination of the firing range. And it was this decision that led to the discovery which would finally illuminate the true sequence of events surrounding Inspector Slack's death. Miss Marple arrived at the range on a crisp autumn morning to find Major Finn directing a small team of men in what appeared to be an archaeological excavation of the earthwork butts behind the target positions. The Major himself was wielding a spade with military precision, while Constable Locke assisted by sifting through the excavated soil. "Miss Marple," Major Finn called out when he spotted her approaching. "Excellent timing! We've made a most interesting discovery, one that I believe will clarify several puzzling aspects of this case." She made her way carefully across the uneven ground to where the excavation was taking place. The earthwork butt, which had appeared solid and undisturbed from the surface, now revealed evidence of recent bullet impacts that had not been visible during their earlier examinations. "We decided to conduct a proper ballistic analysis," Major Finn explained, pausing in his digging to wipe perspiration from his brow. "If Inspector Slack was killed here, there should be evidence of the bullet's impact somewhere in these earthworks." Constable Locke looked up from the soil he was examining. "The thing is, Miss Marple, we found not 1 bullet hole, but 2 distinct impact points in the buttboard." Miss Marple studied the wooden backing board that had been partially uncovered by their excavation. Even to her untrained eye, it was clear that 2 separate projectiles had struck the target area, creating holes that were close together, but distinctly different in character. "How very curious," she observed. "And have you recovered the bullets themselves?" "That's where it becomes even more interesting," Major Finn replied, resuming his careful excavation. "We found 1 bullet embedded in the earth behind the board, but it's not what you'd expect from a fatal shooting." He held up a misshapen piece of wood that bore the unmistakable marks of high-velocity impact. "This is a blank cartridge marker, Miss Marple, the sort used in training exercises to provide sound and flash without lethal force." Miss Marple examined the wooden projectile with growing fascination. The implications of this discovery were staggering. suggesting that the events at the firing range had been far more complex than anyone had previously imagined. "A blank cartridge," she murmured. "But surely that could not have been the shot that killed Inspector Slack." "Precisely the point," Major Finn agreed. "Which means there must have been a second shot, one that actually proved fatal, and that raises the question of timing and sequence." Constable Locke had been following this conversation with evident confusion. "But, sir, if there were two shots, why did we only hear two reports that morning? And why haven't we found the second bullet?" Major Finn's expression grew grim. "Because, Constable, the second bullet didn't end up in the earthwork. It ended up in Inspector Slack." The full horror of this realization settled over them as they contemplated what it meant. If there had indeed been two separate shooting incidents, it suggested a scenario far more elaborate and premeditated than a simple murder. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the various inconsistencies that had puzzled her throughout the investigation. The dictaphone recording that placed Inspector Slack alive at 5 o'clock in the morning, the stopped watch, the overlapping footprints in the chalk mud, all began to make sense when viewed in the context of two separate events. "Major Finn," she said thoughtfully, "might I suggest a possible sequence of events? What if Inspector Slack arranged to meet someone here in the early hours of the morning? Someone he trusted enough to conduct some sort of demonstration or confrontation?" "Go on," the Major encouraged. "The blank cartridge suggests that the first shooting was intended to be harmless, perhaps a warning or a test of some kind, but something went wrong, and a second lethal shot was fired later." Major Finn nodded slowly. "That would explain the time discrepancy. The dictaphone recording captured Inspector Slack speaking after the first non-fatal incident, but he was killed by the second shot, which occurred later." As they continued their examination of the site, Miss Marple found herself increasingly convinced that Inspector Slack had been the victim of a carefully planned deception. Someone had lured him to the range under false pretenses, possibly convincing him that they were conducting some sort of test or demonstration. "The question," she said aloud, "is who Inspector Slack trusted enough to meet in such circumstances, and what could have motivated them to commit murder?" Constable Locke, who had been unusually quiet during this discussion, suddenly looked up from his sifting with an expression of dawning realization. "Miss Marple, you don't suppose that Inspector Slack arranged this meeting as part of his investigation into the ammunition theft?" "What do you mean, Constable?" "Well, if he suspected someone of stealing ammunition and selling it illegally, he might have arranged a confrontation to get them to confess. The blank cartridge could have been part of some sort of demonstration or test." Miss Marple considered this possibility carefully. It would certainly explain why Inspector Slack had been examining the target trolley mechanism, as evidenced by the graphite powder on his metal. If he had been preparing some sort of ballistic demonstration, he would have needed to ensure the equipment was functioning properly. But then, something went wrong. She continued the thought. Perhaps the person he was confronting panicked and decided that murder was preferable to exposure. Major Finn had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. That scenario would also explain the overlapping footprints. If there was an initial meeting that ended with the blank cartridge firing, the participants might have left and returned later, creating the pattern we observed in the chalk mud. The morning sun was climbing higher as they completed their examination of the earthwork, and Miss Marple found herself with a much clearer picture of the events that had led to Inspector Slack's death. The discovery of the two bullet holes, and particularly the blank cartridge marker, had provided the missing piece of the puzzle that made sense of all the contradictory evidence. But there remained the crucial question of identity. Who had Inspector Slack trusted enough to meet at the firing range in the early hours of the morning? and what had transformed what appeared to be a planned confrontation into cold-blooded murder. The answers, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in the physical evidence they had uncovered, but in the complex web of relationships and motivations that connected all the people who had been present at Inspector Slack's farewell dinner. Someone among that gathering of colleagues and friends had harbored secrets dark enough to kill for, and it was only a matter of time before the truth would finally emerge. As they prepared to leave the firing range, Miss Marple took one last look at the scene where Inspector Slack had met his end. The 2 bullet holes in the earthwork told a story of deception and betrayal, but they also spoke of a man who had died in pursuit of justice, even if he had not lived to see it achieved. Chapter 10. Dawn Ray and the True Time of Death. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with pale gold when Miss Marple requested that all the principals in the case be assembled at the firing range for what she termed a final clarification of events. Major Finn had agreed to this unusual request, perhaps recognizing that conventional investigative methods had failed to produce a complete picture of Inspector Slack's death. They gathered on the concrete firing platform as the dawn light gradually revealed the familiar landscape in sharp detail. Sergeant Lake stood with military bearing despite the strain that showed clearly in his weathered face. Constable Locke positioned himself nearby, notebook ready as always. Agnes Cutter, released on bail pending formal charges, sat quietly on a folding chair that Major Finn had thoughtfully provided Edith Slack, Inspector Slack's sister, had insisted on being present to hear the truth about her brother's final hours. Miss Marple stood before them with the quiet authority that years of solving puzzles had given her, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully from face to face as she organized her thoughts. "We've been dealing with a case of considerable complexity," she began, "one that has been made more difficult by the fact that appearances have been deliberately arranged to deceive us about the true sequence of events." She gestured toward the earthwork butts, where their excavation had revealed the 2 bullet holes. "The physical evidence tells us that there were 2 separate shooting incidents here, not one. The first involved a blank cartridge that could harm no one. The second was the fatal shot that killed Inspector Slack." Major Finn nodded encouragingly. "And what do you believe prompted these 2 incidents?" "Miss Marple, to understand that, we must begin with the envelope that Inspector Slack received at his farewell dinner." Miss Marple's voice carried the certainty of someone who had worked through every detail. "That envelope, Major Finn, came from your Home Office investigation into ammunition theft at constabulary facilities throughout the county." Major Finn's expression remained carefully neutral, but Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that confirmed her deduction. "Inspector Slack was being covertly investigated as part of your probe," she continued. "The envelope contained evidence that ammunition had been systematically stolen from this station and sold to private gun clubs. But Inspector Slack was not the thief." She turned to face Sergeant Lake directly. "You were, Sergeant. You had been siphoning off ammunition for months, forcing Agnes to falsify the inventory records to cover your theft." Lake's face had gone ashen, but he remained silent as Miss Marple continued her exposition. "When Inspector Slack received that envelope, he realized immediately what it meant. But instead of simply reporting you to the authorities, he decided to give you one final chance to surrender voluntarily. He arranged to meet you here at the firing range in the early hours of the morning." Miss Marple moved to stand near the target trolley mechanism. Inspector Slack prepared an elaborate demonstration to convince you of the seriousness of your situation. He set up the dictaphone to record your conversation, and he arranged for a blank cartridge to be fired as a dramatic gesture, probably to simulate what would happen if you chose to resist arrest. The assembled group listened in fascination as she reconstructed the events of that fatal morning. The first shot, the blank round, was fired at 5 o'clock in the morning as part of Inspector Slack's planned confrontation. This explains why the dictaphone recorded him speaking at that time, and why we found graphite powder on his metal from handling the target trolley cables. She paused to let this sink in before continuing. But something went wrong with Inspector Slack's carefully laid plans. Instead of surrendering, you panicked, Sergeant Lake. You left the scene, but you returned later with a live round, and Inspector Slack's own service revolver, which you knew how to remove from his holster. Lake finally found his voice. You can't prove any of this. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied gently, the evidence is quite clear once one understands the sequence. You used your spare key to unlock the gate chain when you returned. You shot Inspector Slack with his own weapon, then repositioned his body and the gun to suggest suicide. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small object. But you made one crucial error, Sergeant. You reset Inspector Slack's pocket watch to suggest an earlier time of death, forgetting that your own gift watch had been deliberately set 14 minutes slow the previous evening. Major Finn leaned forward with interest. How does that establish guilt? Because only someone with intimate knowledge of both timepieces could have manipulated them so precisely, Miss Marple explained Inspector Slack's watch was stopped at the false time of death, while Sergeant Lakes's gift watch was running slow to provide him with an alibi for being late to their meeting with Major Finn. The weight of evidence was becoming overwhelming, and Lake's composure finally cracked. He gave me no choice, he said brokenly. 30 years of service, and he was going to destroy it all over a few boxes of ammunition. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Agnes Cutter began to weep quietly, understanding for the first time the full extent of the deception she'd been drawn into. I thought I was just helping to cover up some paperwork irregularities, she whispered. I never knew it would lead to murder. Major Finn stepped forward to place Sergeant Lake under formal arrest, his military bearing intact, despite the tragic nature of the proceedings. Harold Lake, you are charged with the murder of Inspector Dermot Slack and with theft of government property. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Edith Slack spoke for the first time since the gathering had begun. My brother always said that the truth would come out eventually. No matter how well it was hidden, I'm grateful that it finally has. Miss Marple approached the older woman with genuine sympathy. Inspector Slack died trying to give a colleague one last chance to do the right thing, she said gently. It speaks well of his character, even if his trust was misplaced. As the group prepared to leave the firing range for the final time, Edith Slack withdrew a folded piece of paper from her handbag. I found this among Dermot's papers, she said, offering it to Miss Marple. I think he would have wanted you to have it. Miss Marple unfolded the note and read the words written in Inspector Slack's careful handwriting. If anything happens, trust Jane Marple. She sees the detail others sweep away. Later that morning, as they sat in Lady Bantry's drawing room over strong coffee, Miss Marple reflected on the case that had finally reached its conclusion. Poor Slack. Lady Bantry sighed, always so brusque with everyone. Miss Marple sat down her cup and gazed thoughtfully out the window at the peaceful village street. Brusque? Yes, but brave, she replied softly. He took careful aim at the truth and paid the ultimate price when the recoil came. The October morning continued its quiet progression toward noon, and life in St. Mary slowly returned to its familiar rhythms, marked now by the memory of a good man who had died in pursuit of justice, and the knowledge that truth, however long delayed, would always find its way to the night.